Thank you. So I am Kim Shashoua, researcher, therapist, and I'm finishing up grad school at UT Arlington. So I'd like to start by asking you all to think of your 3 favorite people. These can be your friends, your family. All right, you have them? Well, if you're anything like the national average, either one of these 3 people or yourself is currently struggling with mental illness. According to the World Health Organization, 26% of people are struggling with mental illness. How many people do you want to play your next game? A few hundred? A few million? Let's say you have 500,000 players. That's approximately 13,000 players with bipolar disorder. 33,500 players with depression. 90,500 players with an anxiety disorder. You might not have these exact numbers, but once you start getting more and more players, it becomes almost inevitable that someone with a mental illness will be playing your game. So what are we doing about this? Not much, right? Well, if you add in components to improve your players' mental health, you can help some of these players, which would then make your work all the more meaningful. Okay, now you might be thinking, adding components to improve mental health. That sounds more like a serious games kind of thing, and I'm just not interested in that. Or, sure, I'd just love to turn my game into a PSA on mental health, but that kind of sounds terrible. And that kind of does sound terrible, but good news. You can add these components to almost any type of game without compromising your vision. How do I know this? Because this phenomena is already happening. If you look at message boards or read articles, you can find these types of comments. I found something like the top about an RPG shooter and something like the bottom about a point-and-click adventure game. It's possible that your games are helping players even if you don't know it. And if you know how this is happening, you can get more of it. That's why I created virtual narrative therapy. Virtual narrative therapy, or ludotherapy, is a framework for understanding how these benefits happen. To create it, I used my education in neuroscience and psychology, my work as a therapist, and my own experience playing games. So I'd like to describe something that happens in face-to-face therapy. Let's say one morning when you're driving to work on the highway, a truck clips your car and you spin out and slam into the guardrail. So now every time you think of driving, your hands start shaking and your mind goes blank. You go in to see a therapist, and she tells you that you have PTSD and that all of your symptoms are actually normal. She gives you a context. Getting hit by a truck is pretty traumatic, and your symptoms reflect how brains sometimes react to trauma. So even though nothing has changed, knowing this information makes you feel better. This sharing of information is called psychoeducation. Learning about our feelings, understanding how our brain works, and developing emotional strategies all falls under this umbrella. Psychoeducation doesn't just have to happen in therapy, though. Games can provide it as well. I'd like to use Psychonauts as an example. It was released in 2005 from Double Fine. How many of y'all have played this game? All right. So for those of you that haven't, you play as a boy in a psychic summer camp. And when things start to go awry, you have to use your psychic powers to save the day. Much of the action takes place in the minds of other characters, many of whom are dealing with different emotional issues. Once you enter a door to their mind, you can help them defeat their literal and psychic demons. It's possible that as you progress through the levels and meet the characters and see what they're dealing with, that you can gain insight into your own feelings. One great level is all about how to deal with feelings. Now, some of you might remember this. In one of the levels, you encounter critical and censoring thoughts. So you turn them off. And then the pressure of these thoughts keeps building and building until they all come out. And then some turn into this mega censor. And then later you're told, you shouldn't even try to turn off your thoughts. But instead, you can harness them and let them out at appropriate times. It's actually pretty good advice, right? Now, I work with a lot of people who are struggling with different anger issues. And this is fairly close to many of our conversations. I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that players would rather hear this from a game than have to spend time with some stranger. So when you add psychoeducation to your games, you're giving players information about something that they may be dealing with. They might not have ever heard this information before, or at least not in a form that matters. And you don't have to jam psychoeducation where it doesn't fit. You can just add a little bit to the narrative to give it realism and depth. The next part of virtual narrative therapy are passive narrative effects. For these, players don't have to do anything. They get these effects just through playing the game. I'd like to explain how this happens in our everyday lives. So, how many of you don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you have had the police come to your house and arrest you? So, I'm guessing not many of you have. All right then. So, in America, when a police officer is arresting someone, what's the first thing that they say? You're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent, right? Well, how do you guys know that? You've never been arrested. It's possible that you've heard this in TV and movies. Well, did you try to memorize this phrase? Probably not. So the repetition of this phrase leads to learning that officers say you have the right to remain silent. And now you have an expectation that if you're arrested in the future, the officer would say this phrase. This type of learning doesn't just apply to phrases. Images, attitudes, interpersonal roles. When you hear that something is transmitted by culture, this is what they're talking about. Now, this applies to narratives in many different ways, but I'm just going to talk about one of them. This example isn't strictly confined to mental health, but is actually something that affects all of us. So there's this myth that only minorities benefit from seeing different types of characters in games. You might have heard this, or you might have only heard it being talked about in this context. But this myth is just not true. In fact, everyone benefits from seeing different types of characters in games. Let me explain. So Jay here plays a lot of games, and in them he sees only one type of female character. Shallow, two-dimensional personality, kind of defined. This woman, you guys know what I'm talking about? So from this repetition, Jay learns there is only one type of woman. Now, Jay didn't try to form this image, like we didn't try to memorize the Miranda rights, but through seeing it over and over again, this image stuck. So now Jay has an expectation that the women he meets will match this image. Now, can anyone see the problem here? This expectation doesn't match reality. There's not just one type of woman. Now, some of you might actually relate to this. You might think of a time when your expectation for someone turned out to be totally different from how you found out they were. Or you might think of a time when someone had an expectation of you that was based in arbitrary factors, like your age, your gender, or what part of the world you're from. So let's flip this around. Let's say Jay sees different types of female characters in games. Jay would then learn different types of female characters exist. And then he would have an expectation to meet different types of women. And he would be able to connect with these women better because there wasn't some internalized stereotype getting in the way. Here's some examples of characters that break this repetition. We have Lee from The Walking Dead, Nilin from Remember Me, and Claire from Thomas Was Alone. Lee is a black man, but he's not defined by his race. His storyline and interactions with NPCs are rich, and Lee wouldn't be nearly as compelling if he were based on some cliché or stereotype. Nilin is a woman and has grandparents from Ethiopia, India, France, but she's more than her gender or cultural background. She's the protagonist and has a complex history. Now you might say, okay, cool, but not really making anything like The Walking Dead or Remember Me. Well, that's where Claire comes in. Claire doesn't have a voice. She doesn't even have a face. But she is still able to break the repetition of female automatically meaning pink and sparkly and frilly and heart-shaped. And in this way, she breaks through and is something that is different. You might say, okay, but I'm only really making one game at a time. When there's all this other stuff that's the same, what good can my one game really do? Well, to answer that, I'd actually like us to think about our own lives for a moment. What led you to become a writer, or to make games for that matter? I'm guessing that many of you can point to a series of concrete experiences that you've had, defining moments that led you here. I know I can point to a dozen defining experiences. So how many of you have heard of BioWare's Mass Effect series? Awesome. I've actually written 2 papers on that. One came out last year and one is coming out this year in an academic journal. So that game is really my jam. So I was playing through the second game and I realized that I had never actually seen that many fully developed female characters before. A lot of times I've seen like a strong female character. Sometimes strong is interpreted literally, like they have biceps and all this stuff. And I don't really relate to some things about that specific type of character. But in Mass Effect 2, I was looking at all these characters that were multifaceted. Some were scared of things, some were different. And I thought, wow, there's kind of more than one way to be a hero here. That was really important for me. And then something amazing happened on the plane ride over here this weekend. So I was sitting next to some guy that I didn't even know, never met him. It's like, oh, you going to GDC? Me too. What kind of games do you like? Oh, I love the old school point-and-click adventure games. Me too, I love Sierra. Oh yeah, their King's Quest games are fantastic. You know my favorite game? King's Quest 6. Both of us, that was our favorite game. This game was released over a decade ago. And we were up there, 30,000 feet, talking about all these puzzles and the names of the different aisles and everything. That one game was so important. It resonated with both of us so much that we were able to talk about it, even though it was released in 1992-93. Final aspect of virtual narrative therapy is active skill acquisition. So this is actually the point where we can make a jump straight into ludology, because at this point, narratives, every other form of narrative cannot do this. This is only really found in games. So skill acquisition. How do we gain skills? Well, there's primarily 3 ways. We're explicitly told, we see someone else do it, and we practice. Games provide all 3. So I'm going to use the game Paponio as an example. How many of you have played this game? So in this game, you play as Kiko, a boy living in an impoverished favela. You escape to a fantasy world where you meet Monster. Monster is kind and gentle, and you can use him to help solve different puzzles. This is what happens when Monster eats a frog. He chases Kiko and hurts his friends. And later, you're told that Monster represents Kiko's father. The frogs represent alcohol, and the violence has parallels to violence at home. This entire game has the potential to teach players how to let go. Shame from being abused. Shame from having a parent who's an addict. Shame from so many things. When we're young, it's normal to blame ourselves for anything bad that happens to us. Now, this is incorrect, but it creates deep feelings of unworthiness that are hard to shake. If you've ever been disappointed or rejected or have any experience with this, you know that letting go of painful feelings isn't easy. But it's a skill that you can learn. Remember the 3 ways we learn skills. We're told, we see, and we do. Well, you are told that it is not your fault. You can clearly see that what is happening is not your fault. And you can let go. At the end of the game, you're told you can't change Monster. So you let him go. At the very core of virtual narrative therapy, at its very foundation, is just one concept. The things you do matter. Your stories don't just exist within games, but they go out into the world and help players make meaning out of their lives. So now that I've gone through all these different components, I'd like to give you some tips on how to incorporate virtual narrative therapy into your own games. First thing you can do is affirm that struggle is normal. So, it is just not true that no one has any problems. Having problems is normal. It's universal. And we don't have to be ashamed about something that's part of being human. The second tip is to add more variety to your characters. And I have a super easy 3-step process to do this. Step 1, write your character. Write something interesting, something you really like. Step 2, change your character's gender or race or some other attribute. Step 3, keep everything the same. You can stop changing things now. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not advocating for tokenism or the kind of mentality of, well, we don't have one of those characters, let's throw it. No. I'm saying that if different representations benefits everyone, then why couldn't the captain be black or female or gay? And just because you have a character with those attributes doesn't mean you have to add in all of this cultural baggage that's been following these representations around. People don't live in archetypes. So when you add a character that's interesting and different, you're helping players accept others, and you're also helping them accept themselves. The final tip is to add realism to your plot lines. So, stories of good and evil. Good and evil is gripping, but hopefully we don't live that way. Hopefully this is not a choice that most of us wake up every day and have to face. So when you add subtleties and gradients to your narratives, you're making it more realistic. And when the story is realistic, when it reflects some aspect of life, players are better able to apply the skills that they've learned. So these small changes are able to give your players a great deal of benefit. So if I had talked to some of you a week ago about players who had mental illness, you might have said, well, that kind of sucks, but it's not really my problem. Well, now you know how widespread the problem is, and you know small things you can do to lift up your players and to give those who are struggling ideas on how to cope. I hope that you implement this into your games. I hope you choose to be a hero. Thank you.